He was falling into endless darkness until wings of light protected him from the unthinkable. Elias had always thought of himself as resilient. Life had thrown its share of challenges his way, but he had managed to hold on until now. It wasn't one single event that pushed him into despair, but rather a slow unraveling. Little by little, the foundation of his life seemed to crumble, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty. His work, once a source of pride, had become a maze of impossible expectations and mounting stress. Relationships he had nurtured for years began to fracture, seemingly without reason. Friends grew distant. Family became harder to reach, and even casual conversations felt heavy and strained. There were no dramatic arguments or catastrophic endings, just a pervasive sense of disconnection. Elias couldn't pinpoint the moment he started feeling like he was falling. At first, it was just a fleeting sensation, like a dream slipping away upon waking. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the feeling became more vivid, more real. It wasn't just in his head anymore. It had begun to invade his dreams. In these dreams, he was falling endlessly through a black void. There were no stars, no landmarks, just an infinite emptiness that seemed to stretch forever. The air was heavy, oppressive, and cold, and the sensation of weightlessness was terrifying. Elias would reach out, trying to grab hold of something, anything, but his hands met only the icy nothingness. He would wake from these dreams gasping, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure whether he had truly escaped or if the darkness had simply followed him into the waking world. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Elias sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the flickering light of a candle he'd lit to calm his nerves. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of a distant street lamp outside his window. He tried to steady his breathing, but it felt as though the weight of the day and of his entire life was pressing down on him. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, hoping for just a moment of peace. Instead, he was met with that familiar, sinking sensation. This time, it wasn't a dream. He felt as though he were falling, even though he was still sitting in his chair. His body grew cold, and the room seemed to darken, as though the light from the candle couldn't quite reach him anymore. His mind raced. Was this exhaustion, anxiety, or something deeper? He wanted to get up, to shake off the feeling, but his limbs felt heavy, like they were no longer his to command. The sensation deepened, and Elias's heart began to race. He felt panic rising in his chest as the darkness seemed to close in around him. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something more. It felt alive, almost as if it were watching him, waiting for him to give up. His thoughts became a whirlwind of fear and self-doubt. Is this it? Is this what it feels like to give up completely? And then, just as suddenly as the sensation had begun, it stopped. Elias opened his eyes and found himself back in his apartment, the candle still flickering on the table in front of him. He let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, so tightly his knuckles were white. He felt as though he had narrowly escaped something he couldn't quite name. That night, sleep didn't come easily. When he finally drifted off, it was restless and uneasy. The dreams returned, more vivid than ever. He was falling again, tumbling through the darkness, but this time it was different. The void wasn't just empty, it was alive with whispers. They weren't voices he could understand, but rather a low, murmuring sound that seemed to echo inside his mind. The whispers filled him with dread, amplifying every fear and doubt he had ever felt. You're not enough. You've failed. There's no one left to catch you. He wanted to scream, to drown out the whispers, but no sound came. He was alone, helpless, and utterly consumed by the darkness. The falling felt endless, as though there was no bottom, no end. He could feel his resolve slipping away with every passing moment. But just as the darkness threatened to overwhelm him completely, something shifted. A faint glow appeared in the distance, so dim at first that he thought he might have imagined it. But as he focused on the light, it began to grow, piercing through the shadows like the first rays of dawn. The whispers grew fainter, as though the light was pushing them away, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. The sensation startled him awake. He sat up in bed, gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. His hands trembled as he ran them through his hair, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. The light, it had felt so real, almost tangible. He could still feel its warmth lingering on his skin, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness of the void. Elias spent the rest of the night sitting by his window, watching as the first hints of sunrise painted the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. He didn't know what the light was or why it had appeared, but it had given him something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of possibility. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. As the city around him began to wake, Elias made a silent promise to himself. He didn't know what the days ahead would bring, but he would keep looking for that light wherever it might lead him. For now, it was enough to know that even in the darkest moments, there was a chance for something more, a chance to rise, even from the depths of despair. The night Elias saw the light began like any other, heavy with the weight of his troubles. He had grown accustomed to the quiet despair that seemed to follow him everywhere, like a shadow, always present no matter how brightly the sun shone. That evening, he felt particularly drained. Work had been difficult, full of small frustrations that built into something larger, and the distance he felt from the people in his life had only deepened. He ate a meager dinner, barely tasting it, and sat by the window in his small apartment, staring out at the city lights. It was in this moment of stillness that the sense of falling began again. At first, it was subtle, a faint dizziness that made him feel unsteady even while seated. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, hoping it would pass, but instead, the sensation grew stronger. It was as though the floor beneath him had vanished, leaving him suspended in midair. The quiet hum of the city faded away, replaced by a silence so profound it felt almost alive. Elias's heart began to race. He gripped the arms of his chair, trying to ground himself, but the feeling only intensified. He could almost see the darkness this time, thick and oppressive, swirling around him like a living thing. It wasn't just the absence of light. It carried with it a weight, a heaviness that pressed against his chest and made it hard to breathe. He tried to fight it, to push the darkness away, but it was relentless. It wrapped itself around him, whispering in a voice that wasn't quite audible, yet was unmistakable in its meaning. The whispers carried no words, only a feeling, a deep, gnawing sense of fear and doubt. They seemed to echo his own thoughts, magnifying every insecurity, every regret. You're not strong enough. You'll never escape this. No one is coming to help you. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Elias felt himself spiraling. He wanted to cry out, but his voice felt trapped, as though the darkness had stolen it. Just when he thought he couldn't bear it any longer, something changed. A faint glow appeared in the distance, soft and warm, like the first light of dawn breaking through the night. At first, Elias thought he was imagining it, a desperate hope conjured by his mind to combat the overwhelming darkness. But the light grew stronger, brighter, until it became impossible to deny. It wasn't coming from outside or above. It seemed to originate from within him, radiating outward and pushing against the shadows. Elias blinked, his breath catching in his throat. The light wasn't just a glow, it was alive. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, and with each pulse, it grew warmer and more vibrant. It surrounded him, wrapping him in a cocoon of comfort and safety. The darkness, so powerful just moments before, began to retreat, shrinking back as though it couldn't bear to exist in the presence of the light. As the light enveloped him, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in what seemed like an eternity: peace. It wasn't just the absence of fear. It was a profound sense of calm, a deep knowing that he was safe. The whispers that had tormented him moments before were gone, replaced by a single, clear voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You are not alone." The words weren't spoken aloud, but Elias felt them resonate within him, as though they were being etched directly into his soul. The voice was gentle, soothing, and filled with an unmistakable sense of love and compassion. It carried no judgment, only reassurance, and Elias felt his heart swell with a sense of relief he hadn't realized he was longing for. Tears streamed down his face as the light grew brighter, illuminating his surroundings in a soft, golden glow. He could see now that the light wasn't just a formless energy, it had shape, movement. Two enormous wings, shimmering and translucent, stretched out from the source of the light. They were unlike anything Elias had ever seen, not quite solid, yet not entirely ethereal, as though they were made of light itself. The wings moved gracefully, enveloping him in their radiant embrace. Elias reached out tentatively, his fingers trembling, and as he did, he felt a warmth unlike anything he'd ever known. It wasn't just physical warmth, it was emotional, spiritual, a feeling of being completely and utterly loved. The wings didn't belong to any being he could see, but he knew instinctively that they were there to protect him, to guide him. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to be held, surrendering to the light and the peace it brought. For what felt like an eternity, Elias remained in that state, suspended in the light. He felt no sense of time, no urgency, only stillness and serenity. The darkness was gone, and with it, the fear and despair that had weighed him down for so long. In its place was a profound sense of hope, a quiet yet unshakable belief that he was not alone in his struggles. When the light began to fade, Elias felt a pang of longing, but the voice returned, gentle and reassuring. "This is not the end. You are stronger than you know. Trust in the light, and it will guide you." The words echoed in his mind as the light grew dimmer, and soon Elias found himself back in his apartment. The city's sounds had returned, and the flickering candle on his table cast long shadows on the walls. He sat in silence, his hands resting on his lap, his heart still racing from the intensity of what he had experienced. Elias looked around the room, half expecting to see the wings still hovering nearby, but there was no sign of them. Yet he felt their presence, a lingering warmth that seemed to fill the space around him. He knew, deep in his heart, that he hadn't imagined it. The light, the wings, the voice, it had all been real. For the first time in months, Elias allowed himself to smile. It wasn't a wide, jubilant smile, but a small, hopeful one. The weight on his chest had lifted, replaced by a quiet determination. He didn't know what the days ahead would bring, but he felt ready to face them. He had been given a gift, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could still find its way through. That night, Elias slept peacefully for the first time in what felt like forever. The dreams of falling didn't return. Instead, he dreamed of light, soft, golden, and ever-present, guiding him towards something greater than himself. As the first rays of dawn broke through his window, Elias woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The memory of the light and the wings was vivid in his mind, and he knew it would stay with him, a beacon to guide him whenever the darkness threatened to return. In the days following his encounter with the light, Elias found himself viewing the world differently. The experience had left him shaken, but not in a way that felt frightening. Instead, it was as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a reality that had always been there, just waiting for him to notice. The memory of the wings, shimmering and radiant, stayed with him, not as a fleeting dream, but as a presence he could almost feel. At first, Elias wasn't sure what to make of it all. Was it a sign? A message? Or perhaps something his mind had conjured in a moment of desperation? But as he went about his daily life, he began to notice small, inexplicable moments, subtle yet profound, that seemed to point towards something greater at work. The first sign came on an otherwise ordinary morning. Elias was walking to a nearby cafe, his usual routine for starting the day. The air was crisp, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining the street. As he turned a corner, he spotted something on the ground, a single white feather, pristine and delicate, resting in the middle of the sidewalk. He paused, staring at it. There was no logical reason for it to be there. No birds in sight, no breeze strong enough to carry it from a distant tree. It was as though it had been placed there deliberately, waiting for him to find it. A shiver ran down his spine, not of fear, but of recognition. The wings, the light. He bent down and picked up the feather, turning it over in his hands. It felt almost warm, as though it carried with it the same comforting presence he had felt that night. Elias slipped the feather into his pocket and continued on his way, his mind racing with thoughts. He didn't tell anyone about it. How could he explain it without sounding foolish? Yet deep down, he knew it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a reminder, a small but significant message that the light had not left him. Over the next few days, the signs continued to appear. They were never grand or overt, but each one carried with it the same unmistakable sense of meaning. On one particularly difficult afternoon, as Elias struggled to stay focused at work, his phone buzzed with a text from a friend he hadn't spoken to in months. "Hey, I just felt like I should check in. How are you doing?" The timing was uncanny. Elias hadn't told anyone about the weight he'd been carrying, but the message felt like it had come from someone who understood exactly what he needed in that moment. The conversation that followed wasn't long or deeply personal, but it left Elias feeling lighter, as though a small part of his burden had been lifted. Another day, while walking through the park near his apartment, he noticed a young child laughing and chasing after a butterfly. The child's joy was infectious, and for the first time in weeks, Elias found himself smiling, a real, unforced smile. The butterfly fluttered past him, its vibrant wings catching the sunlight in a way that seemed almost magical. He stood there for a moment, watching as it disappeared into the trees, feeling an inexplicable sense of connection to the world around him. These moments, though small, began to add up. They weren't grand miracles or dramatic revelations, but they were enough to make Elias pause and consider the possibility that he was being guided. Each time he noticed a sign, he felt a quiet reassurance, as though the light was gently nudging him forward, encouraging him to keep going. One evening, as he sat by his window reflecting on the events of the past week, Elias felt a sudden urge to write. He hadn't journaled in years, but something inside him, whether it was the light, his own intuition, or perhaps both, was telling him to put his thoughts into words. He grabbed a notebook and began to write, not worrying about structure or coherence, simply letting the words flow. As he wrote, Elias found himself recounting not just the events of the past few days, but moments from his life he hadn't thought about in years. He wrote about the times he'd felt alone, the challenges he'd faced, and the small victories he'd achieved along the way. But most importantly, he wrote about the light The wings, the voice, the feeling of being enveloped in love and protection. The act of writing was cathartic. By the time he set his pen down, Elias felt as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. Reading over his words, he was struck by a realization. Even in his darkest moments, there had always been something, whether it was a kind word, a moment of beauty, or a quiet sense of hope, that had kept him going. He had never truly been alone. The thought brought tears to his eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. He had spent so much time focusing on what he had lost, on the darkness that had threatened to consume him, that he hadn't noticed the threads of light woven throughout his life. Now, those threads were becoming clearer, shining brightly against the backdrop of his struggles. The next morning, Elias woke early and went for a walk. The city was quiet, bathed in the soft, golden light of sunrise. As he walked, he found himself noticing things he had overlooked before. The way the sunlight danced on the surface of the river, the sound of birds singing in the trees, the warmth of a stranger's smile as they passed him on the street. Each moment felt like a gift, a reminder that even in the chaos of life, there was beauty to be found. By the time he returned home, Elias felt a renewed sense of purpose. The signs had shown him that he wasn't alone, that there was something greater at work in his life. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. As he reached into his pocket to retrieve his keys, his fingers brushed against something soft. He pulled it out and smiled. It was the white feather, still as pristine as the day he had found it. Elias held it in his hand for a moment, letting its presence fill him with warmth and reassurance. He placed it on his windowsill, where the sunlight could catch it, and whispered a quiet thank you to the light, the wings, and whatever force had guided them to him. For Elias, the journey was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer falling. The light had caught him, and now it was guiding him towards something greater, something brighter. And for that, he was eternally grateful. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elias began to feel a glimmer of hope. It wasn't the overwhelming kind that demanded immediate action or bold gestures. It was subtle, like the first stirrings of spring after a long winter. This hope whispered to him quietly, urging him to take small steps, to move forward even if he didn't yet know the destination. The signs continued to appear in his life, weaving themselves into his daily routine like gentle nudges from an unseen hand. At first, Elias hesitated to act on them. He feared he might misinterpret them, or worse, that they were mere coincidences, and his hope was misplaced. But the memory of the wings and the light gave him courage. It reminded him that he wasn't alone, that something far greater than himself had intervened when he needed it most. Elias decided to start small. He began his mornings with gratitude, taking a few moments to sit by his window and reflect on the things he still had: his health, a roof over his head, the kindness of strangers, and the simple yet profound beauty of the world around him. These moments didn't erase his struggles, but they gave him a foundation to stand on, a reminder that even amidst the chaos, there was always something to hold on to. One morning, while sipping his coffee, Elias felt a sudden urge to reconnect with an old friend. They hadn't spoken in years, and their last conversation had ended on an awkward note. For a long time, Elias had avoided reaching out, worried that his friend might not welcome his attempt to reconnect. But now, with the light guiding him, he felt a quiet but firm resolve. What's the worst that could happen? He thought. With that, he picked up his phone and typed out a simple message. Hi, it's been a while. I was just thinking about you and wanted to check in. Hope you're doing well. To his surprise, the response came almost immediately. His friend replied with warmth and enthusiasm, expressing gratitude that Elias had reached out. They made plans to meet for coffee later that week, And when the day came, their conversation flowed as though no time had passed. Elias left the cafe feeling lighter, as though a small piece of his fractured world had been mended. Buoyed by this experience, Elias began to take other small steps toward healing. He started going for walks in the park more regularly, finding solace in the quiet rhythm of his footsteps and the ever-changing beauty of nature. He also made a conscious effort to be kinder to himself, replacing the harsh, critical thoughts that had plagued him for so long with words of encouragement and patience. It wasn't easy. Years of self-doubt didn't disappear overnight, but he found that each time he chose compassion over criticism, the light within him grew a little stronger. One afternoon, while sitting on a park bench, Elias noticed a young woman struggling to carry a heavy bag. Without thinking, he got up and offered to help. She smiled gratefully, and as they walked together to her car, they struck up a brief but pleasant conversation. It was a small act, barely significant in the grand scheme of things, but it left Elias feeling a sense of connection he hadn't felt in years. He realized that even the smallest gestures of kindness could create ripples, touching lives in ways he might never fully understand. As the days turned into weeks, Elias began to notice a shift within himself. The darkness that had once felt all-encompassing no longer held the same power over him. It was still there, lingering at the edges of his mind, but it no longer defined him. Instead, the light, soft and steady, had taken root in his heart, guiding his thoughts and actions. He started to believe, truly believe, that he was capable of creating a life filled with purpose and joy. One evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, Elias felt an overwhelming urge to express his gratitude. He wasn't sure who or what he was thanking, the wings, the light, the unseen force that had guided him, but the feeling was undeniable. He grabbed a piece of paper and began to write, pouring his heart onto the page. "Thank you," he wrote, "for reminding me that I am not alone, for showing me that even in the darkest moments, there is always light to be found, for giving me the strength to take small steps, to rebuild, to believe." As he finished writing, Elias felt a sense of peace wash over him. He folded the paper and placed it in a drawer, knowing that he didn't need to share it with anyone. It was enough that he had written it, that he had taken the time to acknowledge the profound impact the light had had on his life. The next day, Elias decided to revisit a passion he had long abandoned: painting. He had loved art as a child, spending hours lost in the world of colors and shapes. But as he grew older, life had gotten in the way. Now, standing in front of a blank canvas, he felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Could he still create? Would the light within him translate onto the canvas? He dipped his brush into a vibrant shade of yellow and began to paint, letting his instincts guide him. The strokes were imperfect, the shapes unrefined, but Elias didn't care. With each movement of the brush, he felt a part of himself coming alive. By the time he stepped back to admire his work, the canvas was a riot of colors, blues, golds, and whites blending together to create an abstract depiction of light breaking through darkness. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was honest, and it filled Elias with a quiet sense of pride. Over the following weeks, painting became a regular part of Elias's routine. It wasn't just an outlet for creativity. It was a form of meditation, a way to connect with the light and express the emotions he couldn't always put into words. He began to notice how his paintings reflected his inner journey, each one brighter and more hopeful than the last. Through these small, deliberate actions, reconnecting with old friends, practicing kindness, rediscovering his passions, Elias found himself transforming. The shift within him was subtle, but profound, like the turning of the tide. He no longer felt like he was merely surviving. He was beginning to live, Elias knew he still had a long way to go. There were days when the darkness crept back in, whispering doubts and fears into his mind. But now he had tools to combat it: the memory of the wings, the light that had saved him, and the steady reminder that he was never truly alone. And so, Elias continued his journey, step by step, day by day, guided by the quiet but unwavering belief that the best was yet to come. Elias had been making progress. There was no doubt about that. The light within him had grown stronger, and with it, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The days didn't feel as heavy anymore, and the nights were no longer consumed by the oppressive darkness that had once been his constant companion. He had learned to notice and appreciate the small signs of guidance, to take comfort in the warmth they brought. But healing is rarely a straight path. Even as Elias moved forward, there were moments when doubt crept in, when the shadows seemed to linger just a little too long. It was during one such moment, when life felt particularly overwhelming, that Elias found himself slipping into old patterns of thought. It began innocuously enough: a tough day at work, followed by an unkind remark from a stranger on the street. By the time Elias returned home, the weight of it all felt unbearable. He tried to push the feelings aside, to remind himself of the light, the wings, and the progress he had made. But the memories of his struggles were persistent, whispering in the back of his mind. What if this is as good as it gets? What if the light was just a fleeting illusion? Elias tried to shake off the thoughts, but that night, they followed him into his dreams. Once again, he found himself falling. The darkness was back, colder and heavier than before, wrapping itself around him like a suffocating blanket. The whispers returned, too, growing louder with each passing moment. You'll never escape this. You're not strong enough. The light is gone. Elias thrashed against the void, desperate to find something to hold on to. But there was nothing, only the endless, empty abyss. He wanted to cry out for help, but his voice seemed lost, swallowed by the darkness. For the first time in months, he felt truly alone. But then, just as the despair threatened to consume him completely, something extraordinary happened. A faint glow appeared in the distance, just as it had before. It was so dim at first that Elias thought he might be imagining it, a trick of his desperate mind. But as he focused on it, the light began to grow, pushing back the shadows with its warmth. The wings appeared again, emerging from the light with a grace that took his breath away. They were even more radiant than he remembered, their shimmering feathers reflecting a golden hue that seemed to fill every corner of the void. The darkness recoiled, retreating as the wings expanded to envelop him in their protective embrace. Elias felt an overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude. The warmth of the wings was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, filling him with a profound sense of love and safety. The whispers were gone, replaced by a single, clear voice that resonated deep within him. You are not alone. You are stronger than you know. The words weren't just comforting. They were empowering. Elias felt the strength returning to his limbs, the weight on his chest lifting as he allowed himself to fully embrace the presence of the wings. He reached out, his fingers brushing against their golden feathers, and felt a surge of energy course through him. It was as though the light was pouring into him, reigniting the fire that had dimmed within his soul. In that moment, Elias understood something he hadn't realized before. The light had never left him. Even in his darkest moments, it had been there, waiting for him to reach out and accept it. The wings weren't a distant force or an external miracle. They were a reflection of the strength and love that had always been inside him. The light wasn't just guiding him. It was a part of him. As this realization washed over him, The wings began to lift him upward. The sensation of falling was gone, replaced by a sense of weightlessness and freedom. Elias felt as though he were soaring, carried by the light towards something greater, something brighter. The void disappeared entirely, replaced by a brilliant expanse of golden light that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. When Elias woke, he was back in his bed, the early morning sunlight streaming through the window. His heart was racing, but not with fear. It was exhilaration, a deep and abiding sense of peace and purpose. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair as he tried to process what had just happened. The memory of the wings was vivid, as real as the bed beneath him and the sunlight on his skin. He knew now that the wings weren't just a one-time miracle. They were always with him, a reminder of the strength and light within himself. The vision wasn't just a dream. It was a message, a reassurance that even in his moments of doubt, he was never truly alone. That day, Elias carried the memory of the wings with him wherever he went. He noticed how the world seemed brighter, more vibrant, as though the light within him was reflecting outward. He smiled more easily, spoke more kindly, and approached each challenge with a quiet confidence that surprised even himself. As the days turned into weeks, Elias began to incorporate this new understanding into his daily life. Whenever doubt crept in or the shadows threatened to return, he closed his eyes and pictured the wings. He reminded himself of the light, the voice, and the profound sense of love and strength they had brought him. And every time, without fail, he felt the warmth return, banishing the darkness and filling him with hope. Elias also began to share his experiences with others, not in a grand, dramatic way, but through small acts of kindness and connection. He listened more attentively, offered encouragement when it was needed, and spoke openly about the importance of finding light even in the darkest times. He discovered that by sharing his light, he could help others find their own. One evening, as he sat by his window watching the sunset, Elias reflected on his journey. He thought about how far he had come, from the depths of despair to this place of peace and purpose. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but he felt ready to face them. He knew now that the light was always with him, a constant source of strength and guidance. Elias smiled as he watched the last rays of sunlight dip below the horizon. The wings had reminded him of something he had forgotten, that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way forward. And for that, he would be forever grateful. The memory of the wings stayed with Elias, not just as a fleeting moment of divine intervention, but as a cornerstone of his newfound strength. Every time he felt the shadows creeping back into his mind, he recalled their radiant warmth, the golden light that had lifted him out of despair. The wings had not only saved him, they had reminded him of something profound, that the light they carried was within him all along. Elias began to live with a sense of quiet purpose. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic, but it was steady, like the gradual unfolding of a flower in spring. Each day brought with it new challenges, but instead of viewing them as insurmountable obstacles, Elias saw them as opportunities. Opportunities to grow, to connect, and to spread the light that had been shared with him. He found joy in the simplest things. A morning walk through the park, the laughter of children playing in the distance, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. All of it felt like a gift. He began to notice beauty in places he had once overlooked, as though his encounter with the wings had given him a new perspective on the world. The light wasn't just something he carried within him. It was all around, waiting to be noticed. One day, while sitting in his favorite spot by the river, Elias saw an elderly man struggling to carry a large bag. Without hesitation, Elias stood and approached him. "Can I help you with that?" he asked, his voice kind and steady. The man smiled, his eyes lighting up with gratitude, and together they carried the bag to a nearby bench. As they sat and talked, Elias learned that the man, Mr. Roberts, lived alone and often came to the park to enjoy the fresh air. Their conversation was simple, yet it left Elias feeling deeply connected, not just to Mr. Roberts, but to the world around him. It reminded him that small acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating connections that might never have existed otherwise. Elias began to seek out more opportunities to help others, not out of a sense of obligation, but because it felt natural. Right. Whether it was holding the door for a stranger, offering a word of encouragement to a coworker, or simply listening when someone needed to talk, these moments filled his heart with a quiet joy. Each act, no matter how small, felt like an extension of the light he had experienced with the wings. But life has always had its ups and downs. There were days when Elias felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, when old doubts resurfaced and threatened to undo the progress he had made. On one particularly difficult evening, after a long and challenging day at work, Elias found himself sitting in his apartment, staring at the white feather he had placed on his windowsill. For a moment, he felt the familiar pang of doubt. What if the light fades? What if I lose this feeling? But then he closed his eyes and took a deep breath, focusing on the memory of the wings. He recalled the warmth, the strength, and the voice that had reassured him. You are not alone. You are stronger than you know. The memory steadied him, and he opened his eyes with a renewed sense of clarity. The light hadn't left him. It never would. It was a part of him now, woven into the very fabric of his being. And even on the days when it felt distant, he knew he could find it again, simply by looking inward. Inspired by this realization, Elias decided to channel his experiences into something creative. He had always enjoyed writing, but had never considered sharing his work with others. Now, he felt compelled to tell his story, not just for himself, but for anyone who might be struggling as he once had. Perhaps his words could offer the same sense of hope and encouragement that the wings had given him. He began by journaling, putting his thoughts and feelings into words late at night when the world was quiet. The process was cathartic, allowing him to reflect on his journey and the lessons he had learned along the way. As his journal filled with stories of light, kindness, and resilience, Elias felt a growing desire to share them more widely. One afternoon, he sat at his desk and opened his laptop. With a deep breath, he started to write a blog post. He kept the tone conversational and heartfelt, recounting his experiences with honesty and vulnerability. He didn't try to explain the wings or the light in scientific or religious terms. Instead, he focused on the emotions they had evoked and the transformation they had sparked. When he finished, Elias hesitated for a moment before hitting publish. Would anyone read it? Would they believe him? But then he remembered the voice of the wings, the quiet reassurance that he was on the right path. With a smile, he clicked the button and watched as his words went out into the world. To his surprise, the response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Readers from all walks of life reached out to share their own stories of hope and resilience, their own encounters with light in times of darkness. Some thanked Elias for his honesty, while others simply expressed gratitude for the reminder that they, too, were not alone. Encouraged by the response, Elias continued to write, sharing more of his journey and the lessons he had learned. He didn't have all the answers, but he had his story, and that was enough. Each post felt like a small offering, a way to spread the light that had been given to him. As weeks turned into months, Elias noticed something remarkable. The more he shared his light, the more it seemed to grow. His connections with others deepened, and his sense of purpose became clearer. He wasn't just living for himself anymore. He was living for the countless people who had touched his life and the countless more who still would. One evening, As he walked through the park, Elias paused to watch the sunset. The sky was ablaze with color, hues of gold and pink blending together in a breathtaking display. He thought about how far he had come, from the depths of despair to this place of peace and purpose. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Elias felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the light, steady and constant, reminding him that he was exactly where he needed to be. He smiled, his heart full, and whispered a quiet thank you to the wings, the light, and the unseen forces that had guided him. Elias knew his journey was far from over. There would still be challenges, moments of doubt, and days when the shadows tried to return. But he also knew that the light within him was stronger than any darkness. And with that knowledge, he felt ready to face whatever the future might bring.